question for you. I represent the Long Beach side of the LA Long Beach port complex. And I'm really pleased that you're here because in many ways, Washington is a great model for the country in terms of the importance of strategic freight investment. And I really want to talk about freight. You've had in your state a freight investment program and a freight mobility strategic investment board to oversee these investments in freight, especially dealing with the linkages, the intermodal linkages. And as I understand, because of the coordination between all the freight stakeholders, your DOT, your local governments, Washington has been able to leverage state investments in freight infrastructures by more than 6 to 1. But that doesn't mean your state doesn't have major challenges. And so this is what I want to ask also. You've identified Washington a pipeline of highway, rail, grade crossings in congested corridors that are really going to need separation to manage the flow of people and goods. And your Northwest Seaport Alliance continues to set records for cargo volume being up, I believe, 27% from January of 18 to January of 19. So this is going to stress any freight infrastructure as it is. Reason what I'm getting to is I'm going to be reintroducing my freight legislation that provides a dedicated revenue stream for needed freight improvements, and a yearly dedicated revenue stream that has both formula funding and also competitive funding. It makes critical multimodal and intermodal investments. Just in the formula funding, Washington State would get over somewhere between $120 and $150 million a year in just formula funding, and with great anticipation of that going up as freight volumes will continue to go up. What kind of investments, the question is, would your state be able to make if there were additional dedicated revenues for freight infrastructure? What would you need now to help accelerate your freight investments that are going on already in Washington?
Thank you for that question. It's a great one. And I do sit on our Freight Mobility Strategic Investment Board. I'm also just stepped down as the chair of AASHTO's Special Committee on Freight. So these are issues that are important to states other than Washington. More money would be great. How would we spend it? First, last mile connections are hugely important, enhancing those. Changing the makeup of our fleet. One of our principal sources of greenhouse gas emissions in Washington State is the transportation industry. It's 40% plus. Our drayage, converting it to something that was electric or alternative fuel would be a great enhancement to make. Grade crossings. We're a part of the Great Northern Corridor Coalition between the ports in Washington and Oregon and Chicago and all the states in between, working with Burlington Northern and Railroad and others. Being able to move freight fast and safely on our system, those grade crossings are important. Preservation is hugely important. Interstate 90, Interstate 5, if we have to load rate bridges so that full trucks can't operate, we've got a problem. If we have to reduce speeds because pavement quality doesn't allow us to run at speed, we've got a problem. Those are things we're looking at. Truck parking is a huge issue. The safety of our citizens, the safety of our truckers, they're required to stop and sleep. They need a place to stop. There aren't in those places. And you mix that with our ports and warehousing and distribution facilities kind of working banker's hours. We've got all these trucks around the region waiting to come into town in the morning when the gates open with the commuters. So we need to work on that. We also need to work on the whole issue of freight logistics. Our departments typically do interchange to interchange planning for freight. And what we need to do is door to door and think about what's in those trucks. If I have 1,000 trucks leaving the Port of Seattle or the Port of Tacoma and all of them are half full, I have the opportunity to move that same freight with half the trucks or move twice the freight. So working with the private sector on optimizing freight logistics is something that Washington State DOT is looking at and something that DOTs around the country are looking at.
Thank you. And as I end, and just before I yield back, I'd like to thank Ms. McMillan for really talking about the impact of climate change. And you talked about that in any of our investments. those roads may not be there in 30 years. And you were the first panelist to really identify that and talk about that. And so at some point, I'd like to talk to you about more investments in this. But I don't think I have enough time, so I'm going to yield.